Good afternoon, and I realise that I'm probably, apart from the prize giving, the last thing before you get a drink, so I'm going to try and keep this relatively compact. As we've heard already a couple of times this afternoon, we all believe that the energy transition is vital to the future of the planet, and that the planet will be better when we have electric mobility, for example, or hydrogen trucks. Maybe is the answer to that. And the reason why it's maybe is because actually everything that we are going to rely on for the energy transition to be successful has to be mined, dug, manufactured, and turned into something. And that requires a massive investment of energy. And so what I want to do is unpack this age of change and some of the very practical challenges we have to overcome in order to make things more sustainably. At the start of last year, the World Economic Forum did quite a good piece of research with BCG on the supply chain opportunity, as they called it. 8 global supply chains account for over 50% of all global carbon emissions. Us as consumers can eat as many plant-based burgers as we like, and we will frankly make no difference at all. Manufacturing things and moving things around the world is enormously energy intensive. Those 8 supply chains include automotive, aerospace, construction, textiles, food. I'm going to focus predominantly on construction and automotive. And the reason I'm going to pick automotive is something most of us can relate to quite easily. I suspect many of you already have electric vehicles or hybrid vehicles, and you probably think that that's going to be a significant contribution that we as consumers can make to the energy transition. Problem is that industries are just not showing up. There are very, very few organizations that are genuinely baselining and trying to reduce the carbon footprint of their operations. And part of the challenge there isn't their own operations, it's what they inherit from their supply chains. So imagine for a second that you're a car manufacturer. And I'm going to use the example of one of our customers, Volvo Cars. 80% of the carbon emissions in manufacturing an electric vehicle come from the supply chain. They are inherited. And exactly half of that is the electric vehicle battery. Now, why is that? Turning rock into things that roll is massively energy intensive. Whether you're blasting the rock in an industrial mine site or then moving that rock to a processing plant and then from there to various steps of refining before you have a material that you can incorporate within a battery. You're investing an enormous amount of energy into that process. And of course, you're shipping it all over the world. And I'm going to unpack that journey a little bit and try and bring that to life for you in a second. But if 80% of the carbon emissions of a car are now inherited by the car manufacturer's suppliers, and then you pick up the keys to your vehicle, even assuming that you're charging it only with renewable energy as you might be in the Nordics, it'll still cost about, or you'll still have to drive it for about 40,000 miles, very roughly, in order to repay the energy cost before it is net neutral compared to a petrol or diesel engine. Now, how many of us who buy a car actually keep it for 40,000 miles? Well, some do, but many don't. And of course, an electric vehicle has a finite life. With a traditional ICE vehicle, that vehicle might have a first, second, third owner in Europe, possibly then be exported to Africa, and eventually it finds itself being scrapped there. Clearly, that doesn't apply to battery electric vehicles because the battery doesn't have an infinite life. So let's unpack this journey a little bit. Right, so we're now standing in a large industrial mine site. By the way, just to give you a sense of scale, if any one of us was standing on one of those benches, the steps you see in this picture, you probably wouldn't be visible. So this is a very, very large hole in the ground. And that's a ball of copper. So that's how much rock you have to move to get roughly that amount of copper. That's a lot of rock. That's a lot of explosive, a lot of very large diggers, and a lot of very large trucks to move a huge amount of rock to a processing plant where what you come out with is copper sulfate or hydroxide, depending on the metal. And then from there, it goes on to further refining, et cetera, through the supply chain before it can eventually be consumed. Now, copper is used for cathode film inside a battery. Copper is, of course, also used in electrical conduction and a whole variety of other things. We did a project which started last year with BHP the world's largest mining company, to create the first carbon neutral copper delivery in the world. And that was as a result of being able to measure the carbon intensity of the mining operation, attach it to a parcel of material that went on its journey all the way to Southwire in North America, largest wire manufacturer in North America. So now, that's the popular view of mining. The problem is that this sustainability challenge is not just about doing mining more sustainably. It's also about doing it more responsibly. This is an artisanal cobalt mine in the Congo. And artisanal mining, by the way, is not just a problem with cobalt in the Congo. Artisanal mining is actually how an awful lot of the world's gold is mined. It's how things like mica are mined. Mica from Madagascar. Mica is used in everything from cosmetics to pearlescent paint and increasingly electric vehicles as mica paper for heat insulation between battery modules. Some of you might remember electric vehicles catching fire at the sides of roads a few years ago, and that mica paper is part of it. Responsible sourcing of critical raw materials is obviously not just about human rights abuses. It's also about deforestation. It's also about water use. It's also about what happens to tailings. Tailings dams collapses are the scourge of the mining industry. There was one only a few weeks ago that caused enormous flooding. So responsible mining is a challenge. And then let's assume we've managed to source this material. Then, of course, it gets moved around the world. At the moment, something like this year, roughly 78% of all lithium-ion batteries will be manufactured in China. So moving material from the Congo or from Western Australia or from Chile or wherever to China in order to be refined into battery-grade materials. So, shipping is pretty carbon-intensive stuff. And yes, there are ways of improving the sustainability of shipping. There's a vast amount of movement. And by the way, supply chain risk, supply chain resilience is something that all of us in the pandemic became more aware of. Clearly, we all became armchair epidemiologists and supply chain experts because we couldn't buy toilet paper. But these problems have persisted. And the zero COVID policy in China, of course, has exacerbated some of the concerns around the movement of global resources around the world. Layer on top of that, geopolitical complexity. Europe, North America, strategically over-reliant primarily on China for critical raw materials, especially underpinning the energy transition. Almost all battery materials are done in China. And then that stuff goes to somewhere like this, a refinery. As you can see, not only did it take an awful lot of metal to build it, you can imagine it uses an awful lot of energy to do it. And if that's coal-fired electricity, you're clearly not doing it very sustainably. By the way, what we're building here is something that's supposed to be better for the planet, right? So you can start to see the problem with the energy transition. If we can't find a way to shine a light on the deeper tiers of supply chains in order to understand where raw materials come from, ensure that they're responsibly sourced, measure the accumulated scope 1 and 2 emissions attributed to the physical flow of material, in order that by shining a light on it, you can start to manage it, the energy transition is a complete waste of time. And by the way, I believe in the energy transition, which is why I set up a business trying to shine a light on just these sorts of practices in complex industrial supply chains. Now, of course, you then pick up the keys to this shiny vehicle. Now, I touched on this earlier in terms of where is it charged. So, we've all been told here in the UK that we have to buy electric vehicles by 2030, and that's very laudable. We've got some little modest practical challenges with that. They need to become affordable, and particularly batteries are too expensive. Where are we going to park them all and charge them? And can the energy grid deliver sufficient renewable energy in sufficient quantities to make driving them actually repay the energy cost of actually building all these electric vehicles? And by the way, micromobility is a complete waste of energy. If you want micromobility that's sustainable, then walk or cycle. But the problem is that in manufacturing a scooter with a battery in it, you're actually investing far more energy into those raw materials than you will ever repay. The ones that you see on the streets that are public electric scooters have an average life measured in months. They'll never ever get close to repaying the energy cost of manufacturing them. And that is quite a challenge for us. So the question I wanted to answer was, how do we make the energy transition better for the planet? And the answer is, firstly, to be able to understand and digitize the deeper tiers of supply chains. And what that means is attaching a digital identity to physical commodities at their source and following those physical commodities through the various multiple legs of the network of supply chain participants and attaching to it ESG information at each step of the journey. At each facility, connecting goods in through the production process to goods out, and attributing a slice of energy use to that physical parcel of material that then goes on to the next participant in the supply chain. That, by the way, is being done at scale now. If anyone here has an XC40 Recharge, which is a Volvo car, it will come with the traceability I have just described to you. And it is the foundation of the European Battery Passport. European battery regulations coming into force from next year will require not only demonstrable responsible sourcing, and things like the German supply chain law actually have enacted that in law with penalties for corporate executives who are not doing it, but also require a carbon footprint per battery. And you cannot do it without following the materials through the supply chain. Now, obviously, I've been talking about batteries in this talk, but it's just as relevant to things like construction. Construction, of course, principal ingredients, cement, steel, for example, for concrete. You can't make cement without digging up limestone, heating it to a very high temperature, and driving the CO2 off that limestone. Yes, there's a few additives. If you don't capture that CO2, or you don't generate the electricity sustainably in order to heat that limestone up, then clearly what you're doing is adding significantly to emissions. And that's before you've moved the cement around in order to finally use it. We all know, of course, that steel is awfully energy intensive to manufacture. So I want to finish with the thought that the energy transition genuinely has the potential to be a success, but only if we grapple the supply chain challenge in actually sourcing responsibly and sustainably converting those materials into the things we need for the energy transition to make sense. Thank you very much indeed.